Rebecca never questioned why she looked nothing like her parents. While her mother had fair skin and blonde hair, and her father sported dark features with brown eyes, Rebecca possessed striking green eyes and auburn hair that caught sunlight like copper wire. Growing up in their modest home on Maple Street, she simply accepted these differences as one of life's quirks. The first crack in her understanding appeared on her 30th birthday. Rebecca had come home from work to find her parents, Helen and David, sitting at the kitchen table with an unusual tension between them. Her mother's hands were folded tightly in her lap, while her father kept adjusting his glasses, a nervous habit she'd known since childhood. "We need to talk, sweetheart," Helen said, her voice carrying a weight Rebecca had never heard before. Rebecca set down her purse and joined them at the familiar oak table, where they'd shared countless meals and conversations over the years. The silence stretched uncomfortably as her parents exchanged meaningful glances. "Is everything okay?" Rebecca asked, noting how her father avoided eye contact. David cleared his throat. "We've been keeping something from you. Something important." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Rebecca felt her heartbeat quicken, though she couldn't yet understand why. "When you were born," Helen began slowly, "there were complications. Not medical ones, but circumstances." Rebecca's mind raced through possibilities. Had she been adopted? The thought had crossed her mind occasionally during her teenage years, especially when classmates commented on how different she looked from her parents. But Helen and David had always deflected such questions with gentle humor and reassurance. "What kind of circumstances?" Rebecca pressed. Her parents looked at each other again, and Rebecca noticed her mother's eyes were beginning to glisten with unshed tears. "Your birth mother was very young," David said finally. "She was Helen's sister." The revelation hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Her Aunt Sarah, who had died in a car accident when Rebecca was 12, had been more than just her beloved aunt. She had been her mother. "Sarah was only 17 when she had you," Helen continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "She wasn't ready to be a mother, and our parents, your grandparents, they were furious. They threatened to disown her." Rebecca remembered Sarah vividly, her infectious laugh, her wild curly hair that matched Rebecca's own, and the way she always seemed to understand Rebecca in ways that felt almost magical. Now suddenly, those memories took on an entirely different meaning. "So you took me in," Rebecca said, not really asking but trying to process the information. "We couldn't have children of our own," David explained. "It seemed like the perfect solution. Sarah could finish school, go to college, and you would have a stable home." The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Rebecca stared at her hands, noticing for the first time how her long fingers matched those she remembered belonging to Sarah. "But why didn't you tell me?" she asked, looking up at the people she had called mother and father for 30 years. Helen reached across the table and touched Rebecca's hand. "Sarah made us promise. She said she wanted you to have a normal childhood, without the confusion and questions. She thought it would be easier for everyone." Rebecca pulled her hand away gently. The gesture wasn't meant to hurt, but she needed space to think. Everything she thought she knew about her identity was shifting like sand beneath her feet. "She visited us regularly," David added. "She was part of your life. We thought that was enough." Rebecca stood up from the table, needing to move, to do something with the energy that was building inside her. She walked to the window and looked out at the garden where Sarah had taught her to plant tomatoes one summer when she was 8 years old. "There's more, isn't there?" Rebecca asked, still facing the window. Her parents' silence confirmed Rebecca's suspicion. She turned back to face them, and the guilt written across their faces told her everything she needed to know. "What else?" she asked quietly. Helen stood up and walked to the old wooden cabinet in the corner of the kitchen. From the bottom drawer, she retrieved a small metal box that Rebecca had never seen before. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed it on the table. "Sarah left this for you," Helen said. "She made us promise to give it to you when you turned 30, or if something happened to us first." Rebecca approached the table cautiously, as if the box might contain something dangerous. The metal was tarnished with age, and a small key hung from a thin chain attached to the handle. "She died when I was 12, Rebecca said. "Why didn't you give this to me then?" "Because we were scared," David admitted. "Scared of what it might contain. Scared of how it might change things between us." Rebecca picked up the box. It was heavier than she'd expected, and she could hear something shifting inside when she moved it. The key fit perfectly into the small lock, and with a soft click, the lid opened. Inside, she found a collection of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, several photographs, and a small leather journal. The top letter was addressed to her in Sarah's distinctive handwriting, "For Rebecca, on her 30th birthday." With shaking hands, Rebecca untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. Sarah's voice seemed to speak directly from the page. "My dearest Rebecca," it began. "If you're reading this, then Helen and David have finally found the courage to tell you the truth. I hope you can forgive us all for the secrets we've kept." Rebecca looked up at her parents, who were watching her with anxious expressions. "Should I read this alone?" "That's your choice," Helen said softly. "But perhaps you should know that Sarah didn't die in a car accident." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She sank back into her chair, the letter still clutched in her hands. "What do you mean?" David took a deep breath. Sarah had been receiving threats for months before she died. Someone had discovered something about your father, your biological father, and they were trying to use that information against her. Rebecca's world tilted further off its axis. "My biological father? I thought you didn't know who he was." "We lied about that too," Helen whispered. "Sarah made us promise never to tell you, but the threats, they were serious. Sarah was terrified that whoever was after her would come after you next." Rebecca looked down at the letter in her hands, then at the photographs scattered in the box. One caught her eye, a picture of Sarah with a tall man in what appeared to be a military uniform. The man had Rebecca's green eyes and the same strong jawline she saw in the mirror every day. "Who is he?" Rebecca asked, holding up the photograph. Her parents exchanged one more glance before David answered. "His name was James Wellington. He was a government contractor working on classified projects. Sarah met him when she was 16, during a summer job at a defense facility outside town." Rebecca studied the photograph more closely. James Wellington looked to be in his 30s, much older than the teenage Sarah would have been. "How old was he when they met?" 34, Helen said quietly. "It was illegal, Rebecca. What happened between them? It could have destroyed his career and sent him to prison." The pieces were starting to form a picture Rebecca didn't want to see. "So when Sarah got pregnant, James panicked," David continued. "He had security clearance, a wife, a reputation to protect. He offered Sarah money to keep quiet and disappear." Rebecca felt sick. Her biological father wasn't just absent from her life. He had actively worked to erase any trace of her existence. "But Sarah refused the money?" Rebecca asked. "She took it," Helen said. "She had to. She needed it for medical bills and to support herself. But she also kept records, copies of their communications, proof of their relationship." Rebecca looked back at the box, understanding now why it felt so heavy. "And someone found out?" "James Wellington went on to become quite successful," David explained. "He was promoted to high-level positions, worked on sensitive government contracts worth millions. If anyone had discovered what he'd done. So they killed Sarah to keep her quiet," Rebecca finished. The kitchen fell silent except for the continued ticking of the clock. Rebecca felt as though she were floating outside her own body, watching this conversation happen to someone else. "We couldn't prove it," Helen said. "The police ruled it an accident, a drunk driver who was never found. But Sarah had called us the night before, terrified. She said someone had been following her, that she thought her phone was being tapped." Rebecca opened the leather journal and saw pages of Sarah's handwriting, documenting dates, times, and incidents. Phone calls in the middle of the night. Strange cars parked outside her apartment. Men in suits asking her neighbors questions about her routine. "Why didn't you go to the police with this?" Rebecca asked. "We tried," David said. But James Wellington had connections, influence, our word against his, and Sarah was already dead. They made it clear that pursuing the matter further could be dangerous for all of us. Rebecca closed the journal and looked at her parents, the people who had raised her, protected her, and loved her unconditionally for 30 years. "So you've been living with this secret all this time," she said. Helen nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "Every day, we wondered if they would come for you next, if they knew you existed. We tried to keep you safe by keeping you invisible." Rebecca stood up from the table, the weight of 30 years of lies and half-truths settling on her shoulders like a heavy coat. She walked to the kitchen window again, looking out at the ordinary suburban street where she'd grown up, wondering how many other secrets were hidden behind the neat facades of the neighboring houses. "Is James Wellington still alive?" she asked without turning around. "He is," David answered quietly. "James Wellington is now the CEO of a major defense contracting company. He's worth hundreds of millions of dollars." Rebecca remained at the window, processing this information. The man who had abandoned her mother and possibly orchestrated her death had gone on to live a life of wealth and success, while Rebecca had grown up believing she was an orphan whose aunt had died in a tragic accident. "Have you ever thought about contacting him?" she asked. "Never," Helen said firmly. "Sarah made us promise that we would never reach out to him, never let him know you existed. She was terrified of what he might do if he found out you had survived." Rebecca turned back to face her parents. "But I did survive. I'm 30 years old now, not a helpless child. What could he possibly do to me?" David shook his head. "Rebecca, you don't understand the kind of power men like James Wellington wield. One phone call from him could ruin your career, your credit, your entire life. He has connections in government agencies, law enforcement, the military." Rebecca walked back to the table and picked up the photograph of James Wellington again. Looking at it now, she could see herself in his features, the shape of his nose, the set of his shoulders, even the way he held his head. "What if I don't want to hide anymore?" she asked. The question hung in the air between them. Helen and David looked at each other with the same worried expressions they'd worn when Rebecca was a teenager asking to stay out past midnight. "What would you do?" Helen asked. Rebecca sat back down and began looking through the other letters in the box. Most were from Sarah to Helen and David, discussing Rebecca's care and upbringing. But at the bottom of the stack, she found something different. A letter addressed to James Wellington that had never been sent. She opened it carefully and read Sarah's words, written just weeks before her death. In the letter, Sarah told James about Rebecca's existence and demanded that he take responsibility for his daughter. She threatened to go public with their relationship and his abandonment unless he provided financial support for Rebecca's education and future. She was going to contact him, Rebecca said, showing the letter to her parents. David nodded grimly. "We found this in her apartment after she died. She never got the chance to send it." Rebecca folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box. For several minutes, the three of them sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Rebecca spoke. "I'm not going to contact him." Helen and David both looked surprised. "But not because I'm afraid," Rebecca continued. "It's because I realized something while reading Sarah's letters. She spent the last months of her life consumed by anger and fear about James Wellington. She let him control her thoughts, her actions, her peace of mind, even though he wasn't physically present in her life." Rebecca stood up and walked to where Helen sat, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You two gave me something James Wellington never could. A stable, loving home. You taught me values, supported my dreams, and showed me what unconditional love looks like. Sarah gave me life, but you gave me a childhood worth having." Tears flowed freely down Helen's cheeks now, and David removed his glasses to wipe his eyes. "James Wellington is a stranger to me," Rebecca continued. "He may share my DNA, but he's not my father. David is. Helen is my mother, even if she didn't give birth to me. And Sarah will always be the aunt who loved me enough to make sure I was raised by people who would put my welfare above everything else." Rebecca returned to the box and carefully placed all the letters and photographs back inside, along with the journal documenting Sarah's final months. "What will you do with all of this?" David asked. "I'm going to keep it," Rebecca said, closing the lid and turning the small key in the lock. "Not because I'm planning to use it, but because it's part of my history. Sarah deserves to be remembered for who she really was, my mother, not just my aunt. And you two deserve credit for making the hardest decision parents can make, putting your child's needs above your own fears." Rebecca picked up the box and held it against her chest. "I forgive you for keeping this secret. I understand why you did it, and I'm grateful that you finally trusted me enough to share the truth." Helen stood up and embraced Rebecca, followed by David. The three of them stood together in the kitchen where Rebecca had grown up, no longer bound by secrets but united by the love that had sustained them through 30 years of hidden truths. Later that evening, Rebecca drove to the cemetery where Sarah was buried. She placed fresh flowers on the grave and sat quietly in the gathering dusk, finally able to say goodbye to the woman who had given her life and then sacrificed her own peace to protect it. As she drove home, Rebecca realized that knowing the truth about her identity hadn't changed who she was. It had simply completed the picture. She was still the same person who loved teaching third grade, who called Helen and David every Sunday, who made terrible jokes and cried during romantic movies. The difference was that now she understood the full depth of love that had shaped her life. Three people, Sarah, Helen, and David, had each made enormous sacrifices to ensure her safety and happiness. James Wellington had given her nothing but genetic material, and that was his loss, not hers. Rebecca pulled into the driveway of her small apartment and sat for a moment, looking at the ordinary building where she'd lived for the past 5 years. Tomorrow, she would go to work and teach her students about family trees during their social studies lesson. She would tell them what she'd always believed to be true, that families are defined not by blood alone, but by the people who choose to love and care for each other every single day. The box of secrets would go on a shelf in her closet, kept safe but no longer controlling her future. James Wellington could continue his successful life, unaware that the daughter he'd tried to erase had grown up to be happy, fulfilled, and surrounded by people who valued her for exactly who she was. Rebecca smiled as she unlocked her front door. Some secrets, once revealed, lose their power to frighten. Others become treasures that illuminate the true meaning of love and family. After 30 years of hidden truths, she finally understood the difference.
Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. There's a lot more interesting content coming soon.